Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're taking a deep dive into John Lewis Gaddis's The Cold War. A new history.
Oh, this is a good one.
It is. We've got your notes and highlights ready to go, so get comfy because we're about to explore a truly fascinating period of history.
A period that still shapes so much of our world today, even decades after the Berlin Wall fell.
Exactly. And Gaddis does such an incredible job of weaving together a narrative that is both sweeping and insightful. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, can you give us a quick overview of the book's main themes?
Sure, Gaddis essentially argues that the Cold War, despite its terrifying potential for global destruction, was a necessary contest. It was a clash of ideologies, a nuclear standoff, a struggle for global dominance. But ultimately, it resolved some fundamental issues that might have led to even greater conflict down the line.
Okay, so a necessary contest. That's a pretty bold statement. What are some of the key takeaways that support that idea?
Well, Gaddis dives deep into the origins of the Cold War, tracing it back to the inherent tensions within the Grand Alliance of World War II.
Yeah.
The U.S. and the Soviet Union, despite their shared victory over fascism, had vastly different visions for the post-war world. It was a clash between communism and capitalism, between totalitarian control and democratic ideals.
So right from the start, the seeds of mistrust were already there.
Absolutely. And those seeds quickly sprouted. Gaddis highlights events like the Yalta Conference, where the division of Europe was negotiated, or perhaps we should say imposed, and the Truman Doctrine, which signaled America's commitment to containing the spread of communism.
Containment. Now, that's a word you hear a lot when talking about the Cold War.
It was the cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy for decades. The idea was to prevent communism from spreading beyond its existing borders through a combination of military strength, economic aid, and political pressure.
And this led to all sorts of proxy wars and interventions, right? Korea, Vietnam, just to name a few.
Exactly. And Gaddis doesn't shy away from the complexities and moral ambiguities of these conflicts. He shows how the Cold War wasn't just a black and white struggle, but a messy, often brutal affair with far-reaching consequences.
Speaking of messy and brutal, how does the nuclear arms race fit into all of this? That must have been terrifying for people living through it.
Absolutely. The development of atomic and then hydrogen bombs cast a long shadow over the entire Cold War. It's almost unimaginable today living under the constant threat of annihilation.
I remember reading about those duck and cover drills they used to do in schools.
It's a chilling reminder of how real the threat was, and Gaddis explores the concept of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, the idea that a full-blown nuclear war would be suicidal for both sides.
So fear itself became a kind of deterrent. It's a strange paradox, isn't it? The most powerful weapons ever created actually helped to prevent a global war.
Exactly, and Gaddis argues that this was a crucial factor in the Cold War's relative stability. It forced both sides to be cautious to calculate their moves carefully to avoid any actions that might trigger an apocalyptic response.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this idea of a necessary contest takes shape. It wasn't pretty, but it might have prevented something even worse.
That's the essence of Gaddis's argument. He doesn't glorify the Cold War, but he does suggest that it was a necessary crucible that ultimately led to a more stable world order.
Well, let's dig into the specifics of that crucible, shall we? I'm ready to get into the details.
Let's do it.
Gaddis starts his book by taking us back to the end of World War II, a time when the world was still reeling from the devastation of conflict. He mentions George Orwell's 1984 in the first chapter. That's an interesting choice, don't you think?
It is. Published in 1949, Orwell's dystopian novel perfectly captured the growing anxieties of the early Cold War period. This fear of totalitarianism surveillance and the suppression of individual liberties was very real, particularly as the Iron Curtain descended across Europe.
Yeah. It's amazing how a work of fiction can so accurately reflect and perhaps even influence the political climate of its time.
Gaddis uses it brilliantly to set the stage for the ideological battle that was about to unfold. He then jumps into the breakdown of the wartime alliance between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It's fascinating to see how quickly the cracks began to appear.
The Yalta Conference in 1945, right? That seems to be a key turning point.
Absolutely. At Yalta, the big three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, met to discuss the post-war order. But even as they celebrated victory, their fundamental disagreements over the future of Europe were becoming increasingly apparent.
Gaddis really digs into the issue of Poland, doesn't he?
He does. Poland became a symbol of the growing divide between East and West. Stalin was determined to install a pro-Soviet government in Warsaw despite promises of free elections, while the Western allies were committed to the principle of self-determination.
Talk about a recipe for conflict.
It was a clear indication of Stalin's intentions, and it set the stage for the decades-long struggle over the fate of Europe.
So how did the United States respond to this Soviet expansionism?
With the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. The Truman Doctrine, announced in 1947, essentially pledged American support to any nation resisting communist aggression. It was a bold declaration that signaled a shift from wartime cooperation to Cold War confrontation.
And the Marshall Plan, wasn't that a massive economic aid program?
It was. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, provided billions of dollars in aid to war-torn Europe. It was designed to help rebuild shattered economies and prevent the spread of communism by offering a viable alternative to Soviet-style economic control.
It's interesting how economics played such a central role in the Cold War.
It was a battle for hearts and minds as much as it was a battle for territory. The U.S. believed that prosperity and democracy went hand in hand, and that by promoting economic recovery in Western Europe, they could weaken the appeal of communism.
And it worked, didn't it? Western Europe recovered rapidly while the Soviet bloc struggled.
It's one of the key factors that ultimately led to the collapse of communism. But in the short term, it intensified the rivalry between the superpowers.
And then we have Berlin, always a flashpoint during the Cold War.
Absolutely. In 1948, Stalin attempted to force the Western Allies out of West Berlin by imposing a blockade, cutting off all land access to the city.
But the West responded with the Berlin airlift right, an incredible feat of logistics and determination.
It was a remarkable operation. For over a year, American and British pilots flew round-the-clock missions to deliver food, fuel, and supplies to the besieged city. It was a symbolic victory for the West and a major propaganda defeat for Stalin.
I bet that must have made him furious.
It certainly did, and it solidified the division of Germany, which became a microcosm of the larger Cold War divide.
Okay, so we've got ideological tensions, economic competition, and a divided Europe. And just as things seem to be settling into this uneasy standoff, the Korean War erupts. Talk about a game changer.
The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 was the first hot war of the Cold War. It was a proxy war with the U.S. backing South Korea and the Soviet Union and China supporting North Korea.
And it really brought home the global nature of this conflict, didn't it? It wasn't just about Europe anymore.
Exactly. Korea showed that the Cold War could flare up anywhere in the world, and that the superpowers were willing to use military force to defend their interests and ideologies.
What a scary realization that must have been.
The stakes were incredibly high. And as if the threat of conventional warfare wasn't enough, both sides were rapidly developing nuclear weapons.
Which brings us to what Gaddis describes as the hydrogen bomb moment, right?
Exactly. The successful test of the hydrogen bomb in 1952 ushered in a new era of terror. The destructive power of these weapons was far greater than anything the world had ever seen.
So we've got nuclear standoffs, proxy wars, and a global ideological struggle. Where do things go from here? I'm almost afraid to ask.
Well, the Cold War continues to escalate with both sides vying for influence and advantage. But there are also moments of détente attempts at dialogue and cooperation. It's a complex and fascinating story, and we've only just begun to explore it. Welcome back to our deep dive into John Lewis Gaddis's The Cold War, A New History. Last time we left off with the Korean War and the development of the hydrogen bomb. Things were heating up on a global scale.
Yeah, it's almost hard to imagine the kind of fear and uncertainty people must have felt living under the shadow of nuclear war. Did that constant threat shape the course of the Cold War, would you say?
Absolutely. The nuclear arms race, as terrifying as it was, introduced a new level of caution into the conflict. Both sides understood that a full-scale nuclear exchange would be catastrophic, even suicidal. This led to what Gaddis calls the long peace, a period where direct conflict between the superpowers was avoided.
But it wasn't exactly peaceful, was it? There were still proxy wars and plenty of tension.
That's right. The Cold War was a global struggle playing out on multiple fronts: ideological, economic, political, and military. While the superpowers avoided direct confrontation, they continued to support their respective allies and interests around the world.
So how did they manage this delicate balancing act? How did they prevent things from spiraling out of control?
Gaddis argues that it was a combination of deterrence diplomacy and a gradual recognition of shared interests.
Deterrence, that's the whole MAD thing we talked about earlier, right?
Yeah.
Mutually assured destruction.
Exactly. The knowledge that both sides possessed the capacity to destroy each other served as a powerful restraint. But there were also periods of détente, a thawing of relations characterized by arms control agreements and increased communication between the superpowers.
Wasn't the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 a major turning point in that regard?
Absolutely. The Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. It was a terrifying 13-day standoff resolved only through a combination of diplomacy, brinkmanship, and a bit of luck.
It's amazing how a single event can change the course of history.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was a wake-up call for both sides. It highlighted the dangers of miscalculation and the need for clear communication to avoid potential disasters. It also paved the way for the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, which prohibited nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and outer space.
So a small step towards sanity, at least.
A significant step considering the stakes. But the Cold War was far from over. It continued to play out in various regions of the world, from Vietnam to Afghanistan to Angola. Gaddis doesn't just focus on the big picture events. He also delves into the human side of the conflict, exploring how ordinary people experience the Cold War in their daily lives.
That's what makes his book so compelling. He brings the history to life, showing us how these global events impacted individuals and communities around the world.
Exactly. Gaddis tells the story of a Polish family divided by the Iron Curtain, a Soviet scientist struggling with the ethical implications of his research, an American diplomat trying to navigate the complexities of Cold War diplomacy. These personal stories add a layer of depth and nuance to the historical narrative.
So we've got the nuclear arms race, proxy wars, moments of détente, and the human impact of the Cold War. It's a lot to take in. How does Gaddis frame the next phase of this epic struggle?
He argues that the 1970s marked a period of shifting dynamics. Both superpowers were experiencing internal challenges. The U.S. was grappling with the Vietnam War, economic stagflation, and the Watergate scandal, while the Soviet Union was facing economic stagnation and growing dissent within its satellite states.
So the mighty giants were starting to show some cracks.
Precisely. And this created an opportunity for new actors to emerge on the world stage. Gaddis highlights figures like Pope John Paul II, whose visit to his native Poland in 1979 inspired a wave of anti-communist sentiment. And then there's Margaret Thatcher in the UK, who challenged the socialist consensus with her free market policies.
Thatcher was a force to be reckoned with, that's for sure.
She was a key figure in the resurgence of Western conservatism. And on the other side of the world, Deng Xiaoping was initiating economic reforms in China, setting the stage for its remarkable rise as a global power.
It's fascinating how Gaddis weaves these seemingly disparate threads together, connecting events in Europe, Asia, and the Americas.
He shows how the Cold War wasn't just a bipolar struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but a complex global system with multiple players and shifting alliances.
And then, of course, there's Ronald Reagan, who enters the scene in 1980 with a very different approach to the Cold War.
Reagan was a staunch anti-communist who rejected the idea of containment in favor of rollback. He believed that the Soviet Union was an evil empire that needed to be confronted directly, not simply managed.
He certainly didn't mince words, did he?
Reagan was a master communicator. He understood the power of language to shape public opinion and rally support for his policies. His famous Evil Empire speech in 1983 sent shockwaves through the Kremlin and signaled a new era of confrontation.
But Reagan wasn't just about talk. He also significantly increased military spending and launched the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, which was nicknamed Star Wars.
SDI was a highly ambitious and controversial program aimed at developing a space-based missile defense system. While its technological feasibility was questionable, it signaled Reagan's determination to challenge the Soviet Union on every front.
So we've got a more assertive U.S. under Reagan, the Soviet Union struggling with internal problems, and new actors like John Paul II and Deng Xiaoping shaking things up on the global stage. Where do we go from here?
Well, Gaddis argues that these converging factors created the conditions for the final act of the Cold War. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown, a clash of wills that would determine the fate of the world.
This is getting intense. I can't wait to hear how it all unfolds.
Well, you'll have to stay tuned for part 3 of our deep dive to find out, but I can promise you it's a story you won't want to miss.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Cold War, A New History by John Lewis Gaddis. We've journeyed from the post-World War II tensions right up to Reagan's Evil Empire speech. Talk about a cliffhanger.
And what a final act it is. The 1980s saw the Cold War reach its climax, a culmination of decades of ideological struggle, geopolitical maneuvering, and the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation.
So set the scene for us. What's happening inside the Soviet Union at this point?
By the early 1980s, the Soviet system was showing serious signs of strain. The economy was stagnant, bogged down by bureaucracy and inefficiency. The war in Afghanistan had become a costly drain on resources and morale, and dissent was simmering beneath the surface, particularly in the satellite states of Eastern Europe.
It sounds like a pressure cooker ready to explode.
Exactly. And then in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power. He recognizes the need for change for reform. He introduces perestroika and glasnost restructuring and openness in an attempt to revitalize the Soviet system.
But those reforms, ironically, ended up hastening the collapse of the Soviet Union, didn't they?
It's one of the great paradoxes of the Cold War. Gorbachev's intention was to save the Soviet system, to make it more efficient and responsive. But by loosening control, by allowing greater freedom of expression and political participation, he inadvertently unleashed forces he couldn't control.
What kind of forces are we talking about?
Nationalism within the Soviet republics, for example, the Baltic states, Ukraine, the Caucasus. These regions had long chafed under Soviet rule, and Gorbachev's reforms gave them the space to assert their own identities and aspirations for independence.
And in Eastern Europe, we see those incredible revolutions of 1989. The fall of the Berlin Wall is such an iconic moment, a symbol of the end of an era.
It was a truly remarkable year. From Poland to Hungary to East Germany, people took to the streets demanding freedom and democracy, and one by one, the communist regimes crumbled.
Gaddis describes this as a cascade of revolutions, almost like a domino effect.
And it all happened so quickly, so unexpectedly, even Gorbachev was taken by surprise. He had hoped to reform the Soviet system, not dismantle it entirely.
So how did he react to these events? Did he try to crack down, to use force to maintain control?
No, and that's a crucial point. Gorbachev refused to use the kind of brutal repression that had characterized Soviet responses to previous uprisings, like in Hungary in 1956 or Czechoslovakia in 1968.
So a different kind of Soviet leader then.
Exactly. Gorbachev understood that the Soviet Union could no longer maintain its grip on Eastern Europe by force. He chose dialogue over violence reform, over repression, and in doing so, he unwittingly set in motion the final collapse of the Soviet Empire.
It's a dramatic end to a decades-long struggle. Gaddis argues that the Cold War's conclusion was both surprising and inevitable, right?
That's right. Surprising because of its suddenness, because of the relatively peaceful nature of the transitions in Eastern Europe, but inevitable because the internal contradictions of the Soviet system, combined with the external pressures exerted by the West, had made its collapse almost unavoidable.
So the Cold War ends not with a bang, but with a whimper.
It's a rather anticlimactic end to such a dramatic and consequential chapter in human history. But Gaddis argues that the Cold War, for all its flaws and its horrors, ultimately made the world a safer place.
That's a bold statement. How does he back that up?
He points to the fact that the Cold War, despite its nuclear brinkmanship and proxy wars, never escalated into a full-blown global conflict. The fear of annihilation, the very real possibility of mutually assured destruction, acted as a deterrent. It forced both sides to be cautious, to calculate their moves carefully to avoid any actions that might trigger an apocalyptic response.
So in a strange way, the very thing that made the Cold War so terrifying, the threat of nuclear war, also helped to prevent it.
It's a chilling paradox. And Gaddis also believes that the Cold War, by pitting two competing systems against each other, ultimately led to the triumph of democracy and free markets. The collapse of communism, in his view, was a vindication of Western values, a testament to the resilience and adaptability of democratic institutions and market-based economies.
But he's not naive, is he? He recognizes that the end of the Cold War didn't usher in a new era of peace and harmony.
Not at all. Gaddis acknowledges that the post-Cold War world has its own set of challenges, from ethnic conflicts and terrorism to climate change and economic inequality. But he argues that the lessons learned during the Cold War, the importance of diplomacy deterrence and a willingness to engage with adversaries, can help us navigate these new complexities.
So the Cold War may be over, but its legacy lives on, shaping the way we think about power ideology and the possibilities of peace.
And that's the real value of Gaddis's book, I think. It's not just a history of a bygone era. It's a call to action, an invitation to think critically about the challenges we face today and to apply the lessons of the past to the complexities of the present.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive into the Cold War. A new history. John Lewis Gaddis has given us a fresh perspective on this pivotal era, challenging our assumptions and provoking us to think deeply about the lessons of history.
It's a book that stays with you long after you finish reading it.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. And if you haven't already, I highly recommend picking up a copy of Gaddis's book. It's a must-read for anyone who wants to understand the forces that shaped the world we live in today.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.
That's a wrap.